called on a Wednesday. That shouldn't matter, but it does. My daughter and I have a Sunday call. We've had it for 11 years, since she moved to Portland with her husband. And my first grandchild was still more idea than reality. Every Sunday, 7 p.m. my time, 4 p.m. hers. I could set a clock by it. I have set a clock by it more than once when I've lost track of what day it is, which happens more than I'd like to admit since I retired. So when my phone buzzed on a Wednesday evening and her name came up on the screen, my first thought wasn't something's wrong. My first thought was, she must have the days mixed up. That's how much I trusted that things were fine. That's how completely off my guard I was. I answered it the way I always do. "Hey, sweetheart." She sounded normal. That's the thing that I keep coming back to even now. She sounded completely, entirely normal. She asked about my back. I'd thrown it out raking leaves the week before, and I told her it was better, mostly. She told me about my grandson's soccer game, how he'd scored twice and then tripped over his own feet and cried for 10 minutes and then scored again. She laughed telling it. I laughed telling it. We talked about Thanksgiving, whether she and her husband would drive down or fly, whether her brother would make it from Phoenix this year. It was 20 minutes of the most ordinary conversation I've had in recent memory. And then, right before she said goodbye, she paused. Just half a beat, maybe less, and she said, "Hey, Dad, you remember that thing we used to do? That signal?" I went very still. "What signal?" I said, even though I knew exactly what signal. "You know, from when I was in high school, when I needed you to come get me somewhere, but I couldn't say it out loud. I was already standing up from my chair. I need to back up because the signal needs explaining, and the signal matters. My daughter was 16 when we made it up. She was going to her first real party. Not a school dance, but an actual house party at a kid's place whose parents were in Sedona for the weekend. She was nervous about it. I was terrified about it. But she was 16 and I had promised her mother, God rest her soul, that I would try to give the kids room to grow up. We made a deal. If she ever felt unsafe, at a party, on a date, anywhere, and she couldn't say "I want to leave" out loud without losing face or putting herself in a worse situation, she would text me one word. Just one. The name of our old dog, Chester, who had passed the summer before. She'd text Chester and I would call her immediately, pretending there was some kind of family emergency, and I would come pick her up, no questions asked until the next morning. She used it twice in high school, once at a party where things got out of hand faster than she expected, once on a date with a boy who drove her to a parking lot instead of the movies and wouldn't start the car when she asked him to. I don't like thinking about that second one even now. After she left for college, we didn't need it anymore. She grew into herself. She got better at recognizing situations before they turned. She met her husband her junior year, and that was mostly that. We hadn't used the word in 22 years. Until that Wednesday, she didn't text it. She just said his name out loud, quietly, like she was mentioning something she'd almost forgotten. "Chester." And I said, "I remember." She said, "Good. Okay, love you, Dad. Talk Sunday." And she hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a full minute, just holding the phone, trying to figure out what I had missed. 20 minutes of normal conversation, and then that. What was she telling me? She wasn't at a party. She wasn't on a bad date. She was in her own home in Portland with her husband and my grandson 3 rooms away. So what was she afraid of that she couldn't say out loud? Here's what you need to know about the last 8 months of my life. I retired 2 years ago at 61 after 30 years in facilities management for a hospital system in Tucson. My wife, Patricia, had died 4 years before that. Pancreatic cancer, 8 months from diagnosis to the end. After I retired, I sold the house we'd raised the kids in and bought a smaller place in a 55-plus community outside of Flagstaff. Nice area, good neighbors. I joined a woodworking club, started hiking again, tried to figure out who I was outside of being a husband and a facilities director. It was lonelier than I expected. That's the honest answer. I knew it would be an adjustment. I didn't know it would feel like learning to walk again. About 8 months ago, I met a man named Stuart at the woodworking club. He was maybe 10 years older than me, recently widowed himself, sharp sense of humor, knew more about wood joinery than anyone I'd ever met. We started talking after meetings, then grabbing coffee after meetings, then going on weekend hikes together. He knew people in the community I hadn't met yet. He introduced me around. He had this easy way of making you feel like you'd known him for years. I told him things, not everything, but things. About Patricia, about the house sale, about the fact that I'd done all right for myself, financially. Because we'd been careful with money our whole lives, and her life insurance had been significant, and I'd invested sensibly for 3 decades. I told him that stuff. I thought we were just talking. I was an idiot. My daughter called back 18 minutes after she hung up. Not Sunday, not even the next morning. 18 minutes. She said, "Dad, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly, okay? I'm not calling to judge you or make you feel bad. I'm calling because I love you and something has been sitting wrong with me for a couple months now." I sat down. She said she'd been talking to her brother on the phone the week before, just catching up, and he'd mentioned that when he visited me in September, he'd met my friend Stuart. She said her brother had described him, the way he was with me, some of the things he'd said, and it had bothered her. She hadn't been able to put her finger on exactly why, not at first. Then she'd done something I hadn't expected. She'd Googled him, not his name. He hadn't given me his last name in any memorable way, and I'd never thought to look it up, which tells you something about how trusting I'd become. But she'd taken the details I'd mentioned over our Sunday calls over the past several months, and she'd searched for them. The town he said he was from originally, the company he said he'd worked for, the wife he said he'd lost. The wife's name came up in an obituary, all right. But the husband listed in that obituary wasn't named Stuart, and the man in the photo from that obituary, the widower standing at the grave, looked nothing like the man my son had described to her. She said, "Dad, I think he's been lying to you about who he is." I didn't say anything for a long time. She said, "Are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "I want to tell you what it feels like to hear something like that about someone you've trusted for 8 months. It doesn't feel like anger first. It feels like something shifting under your feet, like the floor is still there, but you're no longer completely sure of it." I ran back through everything, every conversation. Every time he'd asked me something about my finances, and I'd answered because why wouldn't you answer a friend? Every time he'd mentioned some investment, casually, not pushing, just mentioning. Every time he'd said something like, "You deserve to enjoy what you've worked for," or "Patricia would want you to live a little." Every one of those moments, which I had stored as warmth, suddenly had a different shape. He had been building something. I just hadn't been watching him build it. About 3 weeks before that Wednesday call, Stuart had mentioned that he had a friend, a financial advisor, very low-key, not pushy, who'd done really well for some of the guys in his previous community. He said I didn't have to do anything. He just wanted to introduce us, have lunch, see what I thought. No pressure. I'd said sure. The lunch was scheduled for the following Friday. My daughter and I talked for 2 hours that night. We went through everything I could remember. I told her things I hadn't told her on those Sunday calls. Things that had seemed too small to mention at the time. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I was finished she said, "Dad, this is a long con. This is what they do. They find someone who fits a profile. Retired, financially stable, recently widowed, a little isolated, and they spend months building a friendship before they ever get to the actual ask." She was calm when she said it. She was remarkably calm. I don't know how she managed that. I was not calm. "How do you know all this?" I asked her. She said she'd spent the last 3 weeks reading everything she could find about elder financial fraud after her conversation with her brother first raised the alarm. She said it's one of the most underreported crimes in the country. She said the people who do it are patient, sophisticated, and they almost always approach through an existing social structure, a church, a club, a neighborhood, because it makes them seem safer. He had identified me as a target before I'd ever shaken his hand. The friendship, the woodworking club conversations, the hikes, the introductions around the community, all of it had been a setup. And I had walked into it so completely, so gratefully, because I was lonely and I missed having someone to talk to who wasn't my adult children worrying about me from a distance. That's the part that sits the hardest, not the money. Nothing had been taken yet, though it likely would have been. Not the lies. It's the fact that I had been genuinely glad to know him. I had thought, this is what getting older can look like. New friendships, new chapters. I had felt lucky. I had been feeling lucky about a man who saw me as a mark. My daughter wanted to call the police that night. I asked her to give me until morning. I spent most of that night awake. Not panicking exactly. Processing. There's a particular kind of humiliation that comes with realizing you've been deceived by someone you admired, and it doesn't go away quickly. I kept thinking about all the specific moments when I'd felt seen by him. When he'd said something that made me feel understood, that made me feel less alone, and trying to understand that those moments were engineered, that he had gotten good at producing that feeling in people like me. In the morning I called my son. He was furious in a way my daughter had managed not to be, and hearing him furious helped me get less furious somehow. We talked through options. We called a non-emergency line at the Coconino County Sheriff's Office, explained the situation, and they connected us with a detective who handled financial fraud cases. She was not surprised. She said they get these calls more than people think. She also said what my daughter had already told me. Most victims don't report it because they're ashamed. She said the shame is what these people count on. She said telling someone is the most important thing you can do, and I had been lucky that my daughter had seen it when she did. Lucky. There's that word again, wearing different clothes. I want to tell you about the Friday lunch that didn't happen. I showed up. Stuart was there already, at a table near the window at a restaurant in downtown Flagstaff, with a man I'd never met who was introduced to me as a financial advisor from Scottsdale. Nice suit. Good handshake. The kind of easy confidence that I now understand is trained, not natural. I sat down. I ordered coffee. I let them go through the opening moves. Some small talk, some questions about what I was looking for, some very smooth mentions of returns and opportunities, and how a man in my position deserved a strategy, not just a savings account. And then I said, very quietly, that I needed to tell them something before we went any further. I said that I knew the name in the obituary Stuart had told me about, and that the man in that photo wasn't him. I said that I had already spoken with law enforcement, and that the detective handling the case had, with my permission, run both their names through some databases that had turned up some things I wasn't going to get into at a restaurant. The financial advisor from Scottsdale stood up so fast he knocked his water glass over. Stuart, if that was even his name, went very still and looked at me for a long moment in a way that had nothing warm in it at all. Nothing. It was like watching a light get turned off. Everything I had mistaken for friendship just wasn't there anymore. He left without saying a word. The detective had been in a car in the parking lot the whole time. I won't pretend the aftermath was clean. These things are never clean. There was a process. There were statements and follow-up calls and legal proceedings I'm not going to walk through in detail. What I will tell you is that the man I knew as Stuart had done this before, at least twice, in different states with different names. He had not always been caught before it got to money. With me, he had been. My son came out to Flagstaff for a long weekend after it was over. We built a small bookcase together in my workshop. Nothing complicated, just a project to do with our hands. He didn't ask me too many questions. He just stayed. I needed that more than I could have told him. My daughter called that Sunday same as always. We talked about my grandson's soccer season, about Thanksgiving logistics, about a documentary she'd watched that she thought I'd like. Normal things, good things. Before we said goodbye, I asked her, "How long had you been sitting on what you found before you called?" She said almost 3 weeks. She said she'd spend that time making sure she had enough to actually say something because she was afraid I wouldn't believe her or that it would damage the friendship, and she didn't want to be wrong. I thought about that for a while. 3 weeks of knowing something was wrong and sitting with it and gathering enough evidence to bring it to me carefully. 3 weeks of not wanting to hurt me. I said, "You know you can just tell me things, right? You don't have to build a case." She laughed a little. She said, "Dad, I know you. You would have defended him. She wasn't wrong." I think about the code word sometimes. Chester, the name of a dog who died 15 years ago. A mutt we got from the county shelter when the kids were young, and who ate one of Patricia's good oven mitts and was completely unapologetic about it for the remaining 8 years of his life. I think about a 16-year-old girl who loved that dog and also understood, even at 16, that sometimes the people who care about us need a way to reach us that the situation can't intercept. She built that with me when she was a teenager, and she had the presence of mind to use it 30 years later because she'd found something she couldn't say out loud in front of the wrong people. You hear a lot about protecting your elderly parents, checking in on them, making sure they're not isolated. It gets talked about as this vigilance you practice from outside, watching for signs, looking for red flags. I think that's right. But what my daughter did was something different. She had stayed close enough to know the details of my life without me realizing she was paying that kind of attention. She'd registered the name Stuart over months of Sunday phone calls, filed it somewhere, noticed when her brother said something that didn't sit right with what she'd already stored up. She hadn't been surveilling me, she'd just been present. The code, in the end, wasn't the word. The code was everything that came before it. 11 years of Sunday calls. The habit of telling each other the ordinary things, the things that seem too small to matter, because you never know which small thing is the one someone needs to hear. That's what she used. Not Chester. Everything else. I'm not a man who cries easily. My son will tell you that. Patricia used to say I processed things sideways like a crab, never straight at the feeling, always coming at it from an angle. I cried a little after we hung up that Sunday. I went into my workshop and I put my hands on the wood I was working with, just to have something solid under them, and I let myself feel what it was I was feeling. Which was, I have done 1 or 2 things right in this life, and the evidence of them calls me every Sunday at 7 o'clock, and sometimes when it matters on a Wednesday too. If you're watching this and you're older and you've met someone new, in a club, at a church, in your neighborhood, and they seem almost too interested in your financial situation, trust that feeling. Tell your kids, tell someone. The shame is not yours. It belongs entirely to the people who decided that lonely people are easy targets. And if you have a parent who lives alone, call them on a Wednesday sometime, just to see. You might be surprised what they tell you when they're not expecting to hear from you. You might be surprised what you've been missing. I keep coming back to a specific moment, not the restaurant, not Stuart's face going blank when I said what I knew, not the detective in the parking lot. I keep coming back to my daughter spending 3 weeks alone with something heavy, turning it over in her hands, making sure she had enough before she brought it to me. That's the image I can't put down. She could have called the first day she found that obituary and said, "Dad, something's off." She didn't. She sat with it. She kept reading, kept cross-referencing, kept asking herself whether she was sure enough to say it out loud. That kind of patience, the willingness to do the quiet, unglamorous work of being certain before you act, that's not something you're born with. It's something you build. It takes a particular kind of character to hold back when every instinct says to act, because you respect the person you're about to tell too much to get it wrong. That's what I think about when people talk about being smart. Real intelligence isn't just pattern recognition. It's knowing what to do with what you see. My daughter noticed something in the details I'd given her over months of Sunday calls, a name, a story that didn't quite add up when her brother mentioned it, and instead of dismissing the feeling or panicking into action, she built a case, quietly, carefully, with the kind of clear-eyed thinking that most people can't manage when someone they love is involved. And what Stuart had counted on, what people like him always count on, is that the families of people like me won't look that closely, that they'll be busy with their own lives, that the loneliness of a recently retired widower in a 55-plus community in Arizona won't read as urgent from a distance. He had calculated the distance between me and my kids and decided it was wide enough to work in. He was wrong about that. And the reason he was wrong is that my daughter had been paying a kind of attention he hadn't accounted for. The part that still costs me something to say out loud is this: I had to be willing to hear it. When she called back those 18 minutes later and said she needed to ask me something honestly, I had to make myself sit down and actually listen instead of defending him. That's not easy when someone has spent 8 months making you feel understood. Every instinct I had wanted to push back, to say she was wrong, to protect what I thought we had. I had to be willing to look at the things she was showing me even when looking at it hurt. I think that's the part of this nobody talks about. The courage to see clearly when the truth is embarrassing. It's easier to stay in the version of the story where you weren't fooled. I had to choose the true story over the comfortable one, and that choice was mine alone. No one could make it for me. What I know now is that the distance between being deceived and not being deceived was one Wednesday phone call, not a security system, not a financial advisor's second opinion. A daughter who loved me enough to pay attention, and a father who, at the last moment, loved her enough to believe her. Chester was just a dog's name, but it carried everything we built. That doesn't happen by accident.